The man they laughed at on Monday would be signing their evaluations by Tuesday morning. The metal key ring struck Marcus Reed's chest and bounced onto the concrete floor with a sharp clink that echoed through the vehicle bay. A few officers chuckled immediately. One leaned against a patrol SUV, sipping coffee from a paper cup. Another shook his head and smirked without even trying to hide it. "New guy," Officer Derek Collins called out, tossing a thumb toward a black and white cruiser parked near the garage door. "Make yourself useful. That unit needs cleaning before shift change." More laughter followed. Marcus lowered his eyes to the keys resting near his boots. For a brief second, the fluorescent lights overhead reflected off the polished leather of his shoes. Then he bent down, picked up the keys, and calmly slipped them into his hand. He didn't argue. He didn't force a smile. He simply nodded once. The reaction seemed to disappoint them. Derek had clearly expected something else. Maybe irritation. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe a defensive remark he could mock in front of the room. Instead, Marcus turned and walked toward the patrol vehicle without saying a word. The morning air drifting through the open garage carried the smell of motor oil, fresh pavement, and rain that had fallen sometime before dawn. Behind him, conversations resumed. "Guy barely got here and already looks lost. Probably transferred from some tiny town. You know how these departments are now." Marcus heard every word. Years of police work had taught him how to listen without appearing to listen. He opened the driver's side door and glanced inside the cruiser. It was already clean. Cleaner than most vehicles he had seen in active service. The assignment had never been about the car. It had been about him. Across the lot, officers gathered in small groups beneath a pale gray sky. Some laughed loudly. Some checked their phones. Others prepared equipment for the day ahead. No one approached Marcus. No one introduced themselves. No one offered a handshake. To them, he was simply the new black officer nobody knew. A stranger. An outsider. Someone easy to underestimate. Marcus grabbed a microfiber towel from the supply cabinet and slowly wiped dust from the dashboard that wasn't really there. The cool morning breeze moved through the bay, rustling a faded American flag mounted near the entrance. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the city. The sound reminded him of another station years ago. Another first day. Another room full of people making assumptions before learning his name. He pushed the memory aside. This was different. A new city. A new department. A new responsibility waiting just beyond the horizon. Derek walked past again, accompanied by two officers. "Look at that," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "At least he follows directions." The group laughed. Marcus continued working. His expression never changed. His hands remained steady. That calmness seemed to irritate Derek more than any argument could have. For several seconds, the white officer stared at him as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then he shrugged and walked away. Marcus watched his reflection in the windshield. A quiet man in a standard patrol uniform. Nothing about him suggested authority. Nothing announced the years of leadership behind his eyes. Nothing revealed why the chief had personally requested his transfer. The station clock above the garage rolled to 7:12 a.m. Sunlight finally pushed through the clouds, casting pale gold streaks across the concrete floor. Officers continued moving in and out of the building, barely noticing him. Marcus looked toward the station entrance where a framed departmental motto hung above the doors, "Service before self." He studied the words for a moment. Then he returned to work. Around him, nobody realized they were watching the future captain of the entire precinct. By 8 o'clock, Marcus Reed had already learned more about the department than any orientation packet could teach him. The station looked impressive from the outside. Red brick walls, newly painted trim. Patrol vehicles lined in perfect rows across the parking lot. But inside, another reality quietly revealed itself. Conversations stopped whenever he entered a room. Eyes followed him down hallways. Small smiles disappeared when he looked their way. None of it was obvious enough to report. None of it crossed any official line. Yet together, it formed a message as clear as any sign hanging on the wall. "You do not belong here." Marcus carried a cardboard storage box through the second-floor corridor toward the workspace assigned to him. The box was old and slightly worn at the corners. Inside were only a few personal items. A framed photograph of his father. A small Bible with weathered pages. Several commendation plaques he never displayed publicly. A notebook filled with years of observations from his career. The office itself was hardly an office. more like a forgotten corner tucked beside the records room. The single window overlooked an alley where delivery trucks parked during the day. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight cutting across the room. Someone had left a broken desk lamp behind. Marcus set the box down carefully and glanced around. It did not bother him. He had started in worse places. 20 years earlier, he had worked night shifts in Chicago during freezing winters when temperatures dropped below 10 degrees. He had walked foot patrols through neighborhoods most people avoided after sunset. He had spent countless hours helping frightened families, calming disputes, searching for missing children, and responding to emergencies that never made the evening news. Those years had taught him something important. Respect earned through service lasted longer than respect demanded through authority. A burst of laughter drifted in from the hallway. Marcus stepped toward the open doorway. Derek Collins and several officers stood near the coffee station. Their conversation stopped for half a second when they noticed him. Then it resumed. "You hear about the transfer?" one officer asked. Apparently the city really wanted him here. Another shrugged. These days departments care more about appearances than experience. A few nodded. Derek took a sip of coffee and leaned against the counter. "Well, if he stays out of everyone's way, there should not be any problems." Marcus quietly returned to his office before they noticed he had heard. He placed the photograph on the desk and studied it for a moment. His father stood beside an old patrol car, smiling beneath the bright summer sun. The picture had been taken in 1987. Marcus could still remember the day. He had been 10 years old. "People will tell you who they are," his father once said. "Listen carefully, then let your actions tell them who you are." The memory lingered as Marcus sat down. Outside, the station remained busy. Phones rang. Radios crackled. Footsteps echoed across polished floors. Life moved forward. Around noon, he received a stack of departmental manuals and local procedures. No welcome note. No introduction schedule. Just paperwork. He spent the next several hours reading every page with complete focus. Names. Policies. Patrol zones. Internal reports. Patterns began emerging immediately. Marcus noticed details others overlooked. Staffing shortages. Communication issues. Complaints that had been quietly repeated for years. Problems hidden beneath a surface that appeared orderly. As sunlight shifted across the floor and the afternoon wore on, one thing became increasingly clear. Everyone in the station thought they had already figured out who Marcus Reed was. Not one of them realized how much he was already learning about them. The next morning arrived wrapped in low clouds and cool air drifting off the river that bordered the city. At 6:30, the parking lot was already filling with patrol vehicles. Headlights swept across wet pavement as officers arrived for briefing. Inside the station, the scent of fresh coffee mixed with the faint hum of printers and radio traffic. Marcus Reed was already at his desk. A thick departmental report lay open in front of him. Several pages were covered with neat handwritten notes. He had spent part of the previous evening studying response times, staffing assignments, and community complaints dating back nearly 2 years. The more he learned, the more a pattern emerged. Certain neighborhoods received attention quickly, others waited longer. Certain officers consistently worked the most visible assignments. Others carried the burdens nobody wanted. It was not corruption. It was complacency. And complacency could be just as dangerous. To a department's reputation. A sharp laugh echoed down the hallway. Marcus looked up briefly. Derek Collins strode through the corridor surrounded by 3 officers who seemed eager to agree with everything he said. Derek carried himself like a man who believed the station revolved around him. Every joke landed. Every opinion received approval. Every criticism found an audience. As they passed Marcus's office, Derek slowed just enough to glance inside. "Working hard already?" he asked with a grin. "Trying to impress somebody?" One of the officers chuckled. Another folded his arms and leaned against the doorway. Marcus closed the report calmly. "Just learning how things operate around here." Derek smiled wider. "That will not take long. Trust me." The group continued down the hall, leaving behind another wave of quiet laughter. Marcus returned to his paperwork. He had met men like Derek before. Men who confused confidence with leadership. Men who enjoyed being admired more than being effective. They were rarely the loudest problem in an organization, but they often became the most influential one. Around mid-morning, a dispatch call came through regarding a disturbance near a shopping district on the west side of town. Several officers gathered equipment and prepared to leave. Marcus watched from the window as Derek climbed into a patrol SUV and drove away with his team. An hour later, the station settled into a quieter rhythm. Phones rang. Clerks moved between offices carrying folders. Sunlight occasionally broke through the clouds before disappearing again. Marcus used the time to continue reviewing personnel files. He was not searching for weaknesses. He was searching for potential. Every department had people who wanted to make a difference. Sometimes they simply needed someone willing to notice them. Near noon, a young records clerk entered his office carrying additional files. She hesitated before setting them down. "Officer Reed?" Marcus looked up. "Yes. I just wanted to say welcome." Her voice was almost nervous. "Most people have not bothered." Marcus smiled warmly. "Thank you. I appreciate that." She nodded and started toward the door before pausing. "People around here tend to make up their minds fast." Marcus glanced toward the hallway where distant laughter drifted from the break room. "I noticed." The clerk gave an apologetic smile and left. Silence settled over the office once again. Marcus leaned back in his chair and stared through the dusty window toward the city beyond. Cars moved steadily through intersections. People hurried along sidewalks. Somewhere out there, thousands of residents depended on this department every day. They did not care about station politics. They did not care about popularity contests or office cliques. They cared about trust. They cared about fairness. And they cared about whether the people wearing badges remembered why they wore them. Marcus picked up another file and continued reading. Across the building, Derek Collins remained convinced the quiet newcomer was insignificant. What Derek could not see was that every hour, every conversation, and every careless assumption was revealing exactly the kind of leader he had become. The real test arrived late that afternoon when a call came through from a shopping plaza on the west side of the city. Rain clouds had returned, darkening the sky and casting long shadows across the station parking lot. Officers moved quickly toward their vehicles as dispatch relayed reports of a disturbance involving an elderly homeless man sitting near the entrance of a grocery store. Marcus happened to be reviewing community outreach reports when he heard the call over the radio. A few minutes later, curiosity led him downstairs toward the communications room, where incoming updates were displayed on a large monitor. Through the speakers, he could hear familiar voices responding. Derek Collins was among them. The call seemed routine at first. Store management wanted the man removed because customers had complained. Several officers arrived and began speaking with employees. From the radio traffic, Marcus could tell the situation was calm. No emergency. No threat. Just a vulnerable person sitting alone beneath a covered walkway as rain began falling outside. Yet the tone coming through the radio told a different story. "We will have him moved shortly," Derek said. "People are starting to notice him." Another officer laughed lightly. "Probably been sitting there all day." Marcus listened carefully. Something about the conversation bothered him. He pulled up the location on the city map and reviewed previous calls connected to the area. The same address appeared repeatedly. Over the past 6 months, multiple reports involved the same elderly man. No crimes. No disturbances. Just complaints about his presence. An hour later, the patrol units returned. The station lobby filled with the sounds of officers ending their shifts. Rain tapped softly against the windows while fluorescent lights reflected across polished tile floors. Derek entered carrying a takeout bag and immediately became the center of attention near the break room. "Problem solved," he announced. The guy finally moved along. Several officers nodded approvingly. One joked that the shopping plaza would probably send a thank you card. More laughter followed. Marcus remained silent from across the room. Then something unexpected happened. Through the glass entrance doors, he noticed an elderly figure standing outside in the rain. The man wore a worn brown coat and held a plastic grocery bag against his chest. Water dripped from the brim of an old baseball cap. Even from a distance, he looked exhausted. The station receptionist glanced outside briefly but returned to her computer. Most people barely noticed him. Marcus stood. Without saying a word, he walked toward the entrance. Conversations behind him continued uninterrupted. The rain felt cold as he stepped outside. "Sir," Marcus said gently. "Are you all right?" The elderly man looked surprised that anyone had spoken to him. "I am fine," he answered quietly. "Just waiting for the bus." Marcus glanced toward the street. The nearest bus stop sat nearly half a mile away. The man was soaked. His hands trembled from the cold. "Have you eaten today?" Marcus asked. The man hesitated before offering a faint smile. Not yet. A few minutes later, Marcus returned carrying a warm meal and a bottle of water purchased from a vending machine inside the station. The old man stared at the food as though he could hardly believe it. "Thank you," he whispered. Through the glass doors, several officers watched the interaction. Derek happened to be among them. He shook his head and laughed. "We are police officers, not social workers." The comment drew agreement from a few nearby voices. Marcus heard none of it. He simply stood beneath the rain-soaked evening sky, speaking with the elderly man as though he mattered. And for the first time since arriving at the station, a few people quietly began wondering whether they had judged him too quickly. The rain continued well into the night, turning the city streets into ribbons of reflected light beneath street lamps and storefront signs. By 9 o'clock, most of the station had quieted. Day shift officers had gone home. A smaller evening crew monitored calls, completed reports, and prepared for the overnight rotation. Marcus Reed remained at his desk reviewing community outreach proposals when a sharp voice suddenly broke the calm atmosphere inside the communications center. "What do you mean she is missing?" The words carried through the hallway with unmistakable panic. Marcus immediately stood and stepped outside his office. Several officers were already gathering near dispatch. Their faces had changed. The casual confidence that usually filled the station had vanished. At the center of the crowd stood Derek Collins. His face looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. One hand gripped his phone while the other pressed against his forehead. "She was supposed to be at her friend's house," Derek said. "My daughter always calls if plans change." Dispatch personnel quickly pulled up information while officers exchanged concerned glances. Marcus listened quietly from the edge of the room. Derek's 12-year-old daughter, Emma Collins, had not arrived home after an after-school activity. Her phone was no longer answering. Her friends had not seen her for over an hour. The situation was still developing, but concern was growing quickly. Within minutes, officers began organizing search efforts. Maps appeared across conference tables. Patrol zones were assigned. Names and locations filled whiteboards. The station transformed from a place of routine activity into a place driven by urgency. Marcus stepped closer to the table and studied the information. Emma had last been seen leaving a community center near a public park on the east side of town. Rain had complicated everything. Fewer people were outside. Visibility was poor. Details were limited. "We need to focus on the routes leading away from the center," Marcus said calmly. Several heads turned. Derek barely looked at him. "We already have a plan," he replied sharply. "Thanks." The room fell silent for a moment. Marcus glanced at the map again. The storm likely pushed people indoors. Covered locations near walking paths should be checked first. Derek shook his head. "We are handling it." The dismissal was immediate. Several officers avoided eye contact. No one wanted to challenge a worried father. Marcus understood that. Fear often made people cling tighter to their assumptions. Search teams left the station over the next half hour. Patrol vehicles disappeared into the rainy darkness one after another. Radios crackled constantly. Reports flowed in from officers checking schools, bus stops, restaurants, libraries, and nearby neighborhoods. Yet as the hours passed, no one found Emma. By midnight, frustration had settled over the department like a heavy fog. Officers returned to regroup. Coffee cups accumulated across tables. Wet jackets hung from chair backs. Fatigue showed on every face. Derek stared at the map without speaking. The confidence that once defined him seemed distant now. Marcus quietly approached the board again. His eyes moved across street names, drainage canals, pedestrian routes, and park entrances. Then something caught his attention. A narrow walking trail connected the community center to an older covered recreation area near the river. During dry weather, few people used it. During storms, it offered shelter. "Has anyone searched here?" Marcus asked, pointing to the location. Officers exchanged glances. One shook his head. "We focused on the main streets." Marcus nodded slowly. Outside, rain tapped softly against the station windows. Inside, uncertainty filled every corner of the room. For the first time, all evening, a few officers began looking at Marcus differently. Not because of his rank, not because of authority, but because while everyone else had been reacting to fear, he had quietly continued looking for answers. The station slowly emptied again as search teams returned to the field. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock. Outside, The rain softened into a fine mist that drifted through the glow of streetlights like silver smoke. Marcus Reed stood alone beneath the covered entrance of the precinct, studying a printed map illuminated by the yellow lights spilling through the glass doors behind him. The narrow trail near the river continued to pull at his attention. Something about it felt overlooked. Not because anyone had been careless, but because everyone had been focused on the most obvious possibilities. Fear had narrowed the search. Marcus folded the map and quietly walked toward an unmarked department SUV. No one stopped him. Most officers were busy coordinating updates through dispatch. Within minutes, he was driving through nearly empty streets. The city looked different after midnight. Storefronts sat dark and silent. Traffic lights changed for intersections with no cars. Rainwater reflected the colors of neon signs across the pavement. Marcus followed the route shown on the map until he reached the old recreation area near the river. The building had once hosted youth programs decades earlier. Now it stood mostly unused except during seasonal events. He parked and stepped out into the cool night air. The distant sound of flowing water mixed with the gentle rustle of wind moving through trees. His flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness as he walked toward the covered structure. Everything appeared quiet. Empty benches, damp picnic tables, fallen leaves scattered across concrete walkways. Then he noticed something. A small backpack resting beneath one of the shelters. Marcus slowed immediately. The backpack was purple with reflective strips across the front. Rain had darkened the fabric, but it remained mostly dry beneath the roof. Nearby sat a young girl wrapped in a borrowed blanket someone had apparently left at the recreation center. Months earlier, she looked frightened and exhausted, but unharmed. The moment she saw the flashlight, she raised a hand to shield her eyes. "Emma," Marcus asked gently. The girl blinked. "How do you know my name?" Relief washed through him like warm sunlight breaking through clouds. "Because your father has been looking for you all night." Tears instantly filled her eyes. Not tears of fear, tears of relief. Marcus crouched several feet away, keeping his voice calm. Emma explained that heavy rain had caused her phone battery to fail after she became separated from friends while walking home. Seeking shelter from the storm, she had followed the covered trail toward the recreation area. Hours passed before she realized how worried everyone would become. Marcus listened patiently, then handed her a bottle of water from his vehicle. Minutes later, dispatch confirmed her identity. The radio in Marcus's hand crackled with excitement as updates spread through the department. Search teams redirected. Officers celebrated. A father who had spent hours trapped between fear and hope finally received the news he had desperately needed. Marcus looked toward the river where the dark water moved quietly beneath the night sky. The storm was ending. In the distance, the first faint break in the clouds revealed a handful of stars. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply helped Emma into the warm vehicle and began the drive back toward the station, unaware that by sunrise everything inside that building was about to change. By the time Marcus Reed's vehicle rolled into the station parking lot, the eastern horizon was beginning to glow with the faint blue light that comes just before sunrise. The rain had finally stopped. Water still clung to tree branches and pooled along the edges of the pavement, reflecting the station lights like scattered pieces of glass. Inside the vehicle, Emma Collins sat quietly wrapped in a department blanket. She looked tired, but safe. As the patrol SUV came to a stop, the front doors of the station burst open. Officers rushed outside. Dispatchers followed. Relief swept across the parking lot faster than words could travel. Derek Collins was among the first to reach the vehicle. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring through the passenger window. The tension that had gripped his face all night suddenly disappeared. Emma opened the door and ran toward him. Derek dropped to one knee and wrapped his arms around his daughter. Around them, officers released long breaths they had been holding for hours. Some smiled. Others looked away to hide emotional eyes. Marcus remained near the vehicle, giving the family space. He did not seek recognition. He did not explain what he had done. He simply watched to make sure Emma was all right. Several officers approached him quietly. The same people who had ignored him days earlier now seemed unsure what to say. One finally spoke. "Good work tonight." Marcus nodded politely. We all wanted the same outcome. The station remained unusually quiet for the rest of the morning. Exhaustion hung in the air. Coffee machines worked overtime. Officers completed reports while sunlight slowly filled the building. Around 8 o'clock, an email notification appeared on every department computer. Mandatory assembly. Main briefing room. 9 o'clock sharp. No explanation accompanied the message. Curious conversations immediately spread through the station. Some assumed it involved the successful search effort. Others suspected a policy announcement. At precisely 9 o'clock, nearly every employee gathered inside the large briefing room. Rows of chairs filled quickly. Conversations echoed off the walls. Derek sat near the front, still exhausted from the longest night of his life. Marcus entered quietly and took a seat toward the back. Minutes later, the room fell silent as Police Chief Eleanor Brooks stepped onto the stage. Her silver hair caught the morning sunlight streaming through the high windows. She surveyed the room carefully before speaking. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to acknowledge the outstanding work that brought a child safely home last night." Applause filled the room. Several officers glanced toward Marcus. He lowered his eyes. Chief Brooks waited until the applause faded. Then she continued, "As many of you know, this department has spent months searching for the right person to lead its next chapter." The room became still. Derek straightened in his chair. Several officers exchanged curious looks. Chief Brooks smiled slightly. "I am proud to officially introduce your new precinct captain." She turned toward the rear of the room. "Captain Marcus Reed." For a second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then dozens of heads turned at once. Chairs creaked. Eyes widened. Marcus rose slowly from his seat. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Derek stared as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Memories flashed across his face. The jokes, the assumptions, the dismissive comments, the key ring thrown across the garage floor. The room remained frozen as Marcus calmly walked toward the stage. Not a single person had seen it coming. And in that moment, every judgment they had made about him suddenly returned with a weight none of them could ignore. The remainder of the morning passed beneath a strange silence that seemed to settle over every hallway, office, and briefing room in the precinct. People still worked. Phones still rang. Radios still crackled with routine updates. Yet something fundamental had changed. Officers who had barely acknowledged Marcus Reed days earlier now found themselves replaying every interaction they had shared with him. Every joke, every assumption, every careless remark. From his new office on the second floor, Marcus could see sunlight reflecting across the station parking lot where patrol vehicles came and went throughout the day. The office itself was larger than the one he had occupied before, but he had brought very little with him. The same framed photograph of his father sat on the desk. The same worn notebook rested beside it. Nothing else had changed. Around noon, a soft knock sounded against the open door. Marcus looked up. Derek Collins stood in the hallway. For a moment, neither man spoke. The confidence that usually surrounded Derek seemed absent now. His shoulders were lower. His expression carried the weight of a sleepless night and a difficult morning. "Captain," he said quietly. Marcus nodded toward the chair across from the desk. "Come in." Derek stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting narrow lines across the floor. For several seconds, Derek stared at the photograph on the desk rather than meeting Marcus's eyes. Finally, he exhaled. "I owe you an apology." Marcus remained silent. Derek continued. "Not just for one thing. For a lot of things." His voice carried none of the arrogance that had defined him before. "I made assumptions the moment you walked through the door." He paused. "And last night." His words trailed off. Emotion briefly tightened his throat. "You brought my daughter home." Marcus folded his hands calmly. "Emma is a good kid." Derek nodded. "She is." Silence returned for a moment. The hum of air conditioning drifted softly through the office. Somewhere down the hall, footsteps echoed against polished floors. Derek finally looked up. "I expected this meeting to go differently." Marcus understood exactly what he meant. Derek had likely spent the entire morning imagining consequences. Formal reprimands, demotions, embarrassment, retribution, the kinds of outcomes many people expected when power changed hands. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair. "Do you know what I learned during my first year as a patrol officer?" Derek shook his head. "I learned that resentment is easy. Leadership is harder." Derek listened without speaking. Marcus continued. "If I spend my time settling scores, this department stays exactly where it is." The words landed heavily in the quiet room. Derek lowered his eyes. "I was wrong about you." Marcus offered a small smile. "You were not the only one." For the first time, Derek allowed himself a faint, embarrassed laugh. It disappeared almost immediately. "What happens now?" he asked. Marcus turned toward a folder resting on the edge of his desk. Inside were notes he had spent days preparing. Community engagement plans, training improvements, mentorship initiatives, ideas designed to strengthen trust both inside and outside the department. He slid the folder across the desk. Derek frowned slightly before opening it. "What is this?" "A project," Marcus said, "and I want you leading part of it." Derek looked genuinely stunned. "You are serious?" Marcus nodded. "You know this department better than almost anyone. I need people willing to help improve it." Derek stared at the folder for several long seconds. The realization slowly settled across his face. This was not punishment. It was trust. A trust he had done nothing to earn. And somehow that made the moment even harder to process. Outside the office window, bright afternoon sunlight illuminated the station grounds. Inside, something far more important was beginning to change. 3 months later, the station felt different. Not dramatically, not overnight. Real change rarely happened that way. It arrived quietly through small decisions repeated day after day until they became part of the culture. The break room conversations sounded different now. Training sessions were fuller. Community meetings attracted more officers. Complaints from residents had begun to decline. Trust, once fragile, was slowly being rebuilt. On a cool autumn morning, sunlight poured across the precinct parking lot, turning every window into a sheet of gold. Marcus Reed stood outside, near the flagpole before the start of shift change. A light breeze moved through the trees lining the street. The air carried the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby diner opening for the day. Officers arrived one by one, greeting each other before heading inside. Some nodded respectfully toward Marcus. Others stopped briefly to exchange a few words. None of it felt forced anymore. It felt earned. Across the lot, Derek Collins stepped out of his patrol vehicle. He paused for a moment and looked toward the station entrance. The same building, the same badge, the same job, yet somehow everything had changed. In the beginning, he had seen Marcus as an outsider, a stranger, someone easy to dismiss. Now he saw something else entirely. A leader who had responded to disrespect with patience. A leader who had answered judgment with integrity. A leader who had chosen improvement over revenge. Derek walked across the pavement and stopped beside him. Neither man spoke immediately. They simply watched officers entering the building beneath the morning sun. Finally, Derek extended his hand. Marcus accepted it. The handshake was brief, simple, and sincere. No audience. No speeches. No ceremony. Just mutual respect. Nearby, several younger officers headed toward the entrance, discussing a community outreach event planned for the weekend. One of them carried a folder developed through the project Marcus had asked Derek to lead. Hearing them talk, Derek allowed himself a small smile. The work was continuing. The lessons were spreading. The future looked different from the past. A few moments later, the station doors opened again. Officers began gathering inside for morning briefing. Marcus started toward the entrance. Before stepping inside, he glanced back once toward the flagpole. The American flag moved gently against a cloudless blue sky. Sunlight reflected from the silver captain's bars on his collar. For a brief moment, the scene felt perfectly still. No laughter, no assumptions, no divisions. Only the quiet weight of a responsibility carried with honor. Marcus turned and entered the building. Around him, conversations resumed. Radios crackled. Phones rang. Another day of service had begun. Outside, the breeze continued moving through the trees. Inside, something stronger remained. Not authority, not rank. Respect. The kind that could never be demanded. Only earned. And as the station doors slowly closed behind him, the silence left in their wake felt less like an ending and more like proof that true leadership had already spoken for itself.